Hello, a warm welcome to our presentation on behalf of Shaddai Tembo and myself, Simon Bateson, as part of the ECQI conference. We're delighted to be here. We're going to speak today on our paper Liminal Relationalities on collaborative writing with, in, and against race in the study of early childhood.
Thanks, Simon. So we're going to start off today by looking at what brought us into conversation and why we felt the need to write this paper. We'll touch on our individual tensions within this kind of work for both Simon and myself, and then move on towards the contours of collaborative writing. From here, we'll look at our methodological approach in terms of the data of us, and then look at how that echoes children and childhood spaces before finally concluding with what this essay has set us in motion towards. Simon and I met at a conference towards the end of 2019, where we both shared the personal histories of our experiences working as men in early years. I think we connected with a shared interest in queering gender essentialist discourses, and we stayed in touch throughout the rest of the year and early into 2020, up until COVID hit, and then the murder of George Floyd hit too in May of that year. And we found ourselves pulled in different directions. The impact of George Floyd's murder and subsequent Black Lives Matter protests led to increased scrutiny in the early childhood profession with regards to what exactly might be done to meaningfully challenge race and racism in practice. However, as we began to reconnect towards the end of 2020, we also felt that a lot of the conversation tended to remain at the surface level. Not enough was being done to move beyond phrases such as diversity and inclusion towards meaningful action in terms of an anti-racist pedagogical approach. Simon and I looked forward to developing a piece of research with regards to this focus within Simon's nursery, but there are also a number of tensions simmering on the surface for each of us. We recognise that the process of coming to do research before the polished research articles and research reports is one that typically happens without any comments or deep level of analysis. It is arguably especially pertinent when Black and white authors collaborate in writing about race. We wanted to explore these unspoken tensions that can emerge throughout this process. This paper therefore serves as a prelude to our forthcoming work on anti-racism and an anti-racist pedagogical approach with children in practice. Certainly for me, in terms of those individual tensions, non-performative allyship, a term from Sarah Ahmed in 2004, is rife during this period. We saw that in a number of ways, but most notably through those Black Lives Matter statements that were being released by organisations that a year later haven't really materialised into concrete action. I was also concerned whether giving my energy to working with white people was the best use of my time in terms of anti-racism. I was also aware of the good intentions of white people that could end up reproducing the very issues that they seek to challenge. Finally, I was concerned about whether I was being tokenized, whether I was simply being used as the smiley black happy face on the anti-racism work that wasn't really making the sorts of change needed.
For myself, key tensions mirrored some of those that Shad's described. The risk of appropriation and tokenism. Was I choosing this relationship and work with pure intentions, or was I virtue signalling? The truth is probably a mixture, messy and sticky, but was it fair to ask Shad to work with that? I had to be honest and name it, but with that come the tensions of what in critical race theory is called centering the white experience, making the story all about my white sensitivities. Both saying too much on this and saying too little had troubled my previous anti-racism work, but I couldn't escape these issues and that they would affect any truly deep collaboration, whether named or not. And lastly, I remain concerned with what kind of theoretical, relational, and pedagogical bridges I can help to build that white colleagues, children, and families will actually be willing to step onto. But as we settled into our relationship, and particularly our shared critique of neoliberalism's propensity to set things against each other, a space beyond merely two opposite sides of a canyon began to open up for us. For both of us, that was mirrored in part by the prospect and potential of collaborative writing itself. In the context of writing on race and whiteness in particular, it was, as we've said, risky, but also we both believed potentially generative. More broadly, but in fact fundamentally linked to constructions of race and racism, was the extension of our critique of neoliberalism into the realm of academia itself and its roots in the colonial mindset of the Enlightenment. Here, collaborative writing per se is not unusual, but the normative rules of individual contribution and recognition still dominate. We want to challenge this within our writing and beyond in early years practice, which in Scotland continues to normalise neoliberal ideals of achievement and individuality from early childhood. We draw inspiration on collaborative writing from, among others, Deleuze and Guattari, and closer to home, Jonathan Wyatt's work with Ken Gale, both of whom emphasise it as a space where new knowledge, language, and plateaus can emerge. We also wanted to find kinship in our approach with particular kinds of pedagogy, notably drawing on the practical application of Mikhail Bakhtin's dialogical imagination by certain contemporary early years specialists.
So working with these knowledges enabled us to understand the fractal and fractious interplays of human experience. And it's this which provided the structural basis for the next section of the article. Now, our original hope in terms of our data was to convey something of our coming together as co-authors, keenly pre-sensitized and committed to attending to our experiences of racism, whiteness, and the tensions at play for both of us. However, it didn't materialize that way. There were multiple fractious subjects between us that we needed to write out on the page. We therefore leaned on the examples of writers such as Sellers, McKittrick, Palmer, and Nagar in utilizing a multi-column narrative, one which facilitates both our opening up to and reflections on the prism of our identifications. The 4 columns that we used to overlay our experiences were authorial, the we boxed, used to gesture towards a kind of corporate identity, seemingly narrating what happened throughout the previous months between us in terms of our experiences of coming together. Subjective, both Simon and myself individually reflecting on our own experiences and our own perspectives of what happened in those tensions during those months of our writing this paper. And finally, this liminal category. This was really the box for us to build on the theoretical approaches that we had written about thus far and play with the boundaries of our individual selves and develop a new subjectivity beyond individualism.
This wasn't a format we imposed on ourselves at first. It grew out of our conversations. A prime example of this is how we attempted to name our beginnings, both to each other and for our readers. We began with an authorial narrative about how we came together, but what of those subjective experiences which couldn't be assimilated into one narrative? Shad's sense of where and how things between us began weren't the same as mine. We even agreed to go back to our earliest beginnings and interviewed each other about our upbringings and formative experiences of race. But these supported psychological linear narratives which belied our commitment to more new materialist analysis. We found it harder to ignore those questions which refused answers but opened up new territory, like what does the idea of beginnings actually serve? Who does it serve? Where might we find ourselves if we loosen those narrative ties? And how might that support our inquiry into culturally dominant stories about race? As our writing evolved, we began to see that its generative liminality had much in common with children's lived experiences, as well as those pedagogies which are arguably best tuned into them. From Paulo Freire's model of critical education, which supports learners to challenge received ideas and structures, identities, to New Zealand's Jane White and also Froebelian circles in Scotland, we see assemblages of pedagogies which foster non-hierarchical relationships within deliberative practice and open-ended play. More generally, we see countless examples of children's innate capacity to resist stasis and certainty as they create whole new ways of knowing and relating from pre-birth through early childhood. Indeed, despite the prevailing sociological discourse about children's agency, which risks situating neoliberalism within the child, children continue to move freely between the fluid, co-constructed identities they're exploring and to put not knowing to powerful, creative and relational ends.
As we move toward collaboration into other contexts, we hope that our experiences here snowball outside of this text into our approaches with the children in our subject nursery. This essay has set us in motion towards a potentially generative and ethical praxis whereby adult and child may be reconceived on more than individualist, more than human terms. Indeed, we hope to move further still and engage all manner of relations in our research environment, the better to decenter our own perspective and decolonize our thinking. We are keen to consider how the very categories of race thinking, including black and white, brought into being in early childhood. However, we remain on precarious grounds, as there are manning rights, to practice new modes of encounter, to invent the cracks of existence where individuality skizzes, is necessarily to be without bearings, and where there are no bearings, the first temptation is to presume to know. Ultimately, it's this middling, this knottiness that comes with it that propels us forward within this inquiry. We therefore leave the final word to Akomolafe, who writes that there are no beginnings that appear unperturbed, pristine, and without hauntings. There are no endings that are devoid of traces of the new, spontaneous departures from disclosure, and shimmering events that are yet to happen. The middle isn't the space between things, it is the world and its ongoing practices of worlding itself. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We look forward to discussion and questions afterwards, and here are our references.